Welcome to Asian Times TV, the home of cutting-edge news and analysis on the Asia-Pacific region and the emerging America's Pacific century, if you will. We have with us today a special guest from RAND Corporation, Dr. Arturo Munoz, who's a senior political scientist at RAND. He has almost 30 years of experience with the CIA, both in the Directorate of Operations level position as well as Director of Intelligence at the CIA. He's worked on counterterrorism initiatives, counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics programs, and so he has a wealth of experience that he brings to the show today. We welcome him to Asian Times TV at Princeton TV. Dr. Munoz, how are you?
Very good.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to start off by talking about this idea of America's Pacific century. A policy that's been initiated by the State Department. Hillary Clinton said that the future of politics will be decided in Asia, not necessarily in the Middle East or other parts of the world. She said this in November and wrote a paper about it in Foreign Policy. What do you think of this idea that America's foreign policy doing a significant pivot to the Asia-Pacific region, and that the 21st century will be America's Pacific century?
Well, I think it addresses a neglect that has been apparent, over the past few years as we focused exclusively on the war on terror. For a while there, the alpha and the omega of our foreign policy was terrorism and whether or not countries supported us in the war on terror. And a lot of people, even in those days, said that's a little narrow in scope and that there's other issues that are of great importance to U.S. foreign policy that have nothing to do with terrorism. Economic issues, political issues. And there's other actors on the world stage, for example, China. But not just China. I mean, you take Indonesia. It's the world's most populous Muslim country, which has a very large population and, the tremendous economic activity. And the other countries of Asia. And the complaint was that we have been neglecting these countries. So what I see is that the Obama administration is now addressing that issue and giving these countries the attention and the importance that they merit.
So when you say
said that, I hope that this new policy focusing on Asia doesn't mean that then we're now going to neglect other parts of the world. For example, Latin America.
Right.
Mexico, Colombia, these other countries that are also important to us. And I hope it doesn't mean, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it at length in this interview, that we're going to walk away from Afghanistan. So I hope that we're going to have a balanced approach. And emphasizing, giving priority to Asia, we're then not going to neglect other countries.
So when you say a complaint from these other smaller countries in the Pacific Rim, was there actually a vociferous, call for attention by smaller countries in the Pacific who needed, assistance or aid or, State Department's help in terms of structuring or dealing with China potentially or other issues?
When I said complaint, I meant to say among analysts.
I see.
And among diplomats who were assigned to those countries, who saw an excessive amount of attention being paid to the issue of terrorism and not enough attention paid to other issues. Now, some of those countries may indeed have complained, but I actually don't have any information on that.
No, and rightly you mentioned Indonesia, and of course Indonesia became the focus partly of press, recent press, partly because President Obama has spent his childhood in Indonesia, and obviously I've written about that in my book on Barack Obama and Hawaii and Indonesia. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, Hillary Clinton, Paul Wolfowitz, and others have said openly that Indonesia is a model that other Islamic countries need to follow, given it's the largest populous Islamic democracy. So is that another point of interest in terms of policy, American policy moving forward?
Well, absolutely, and I would emphasize again the democracy of Indonesia. I really think that a lot of Americans are not even aware of the vibrant democracy that you do have in Indonesia. And a lot of times when I hear the public discourse about Islamic countries here in the United States, I think the assumption of most Americans is that, most Islamic countries are not democratic. Mm-hmm. And I think Indonesia is a tremendous example to the contrary. And it's a country that I think we should have more of a relationship with.
Right, it's quite vibrant economically as well.
And that as well.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So, excellent. So now moving slightly, back to the Afghanistan-Pakistan area, I know that you yourself have been quite focused on the implementation of policy in that region, specifically in terms of the drawdown. So update me now in terms of where we are in terms of the drawdown that's to be implemented effectively by 2014. But it seems like the news is that it's going to even maybe happen or take place slightly faster and sooner than expected.
Well, we are in the process of drawdown as we speak. I mean, it is being implemented. Now, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's some debate as to whether or not we're going to accelerate the pace. I don't think that's likely, because I think that the 2014 time frame that's been set is a reasonable time frame to achieve the goals that have been set. And I don't know that if we have the logistical capability to actually pull out equipment and pull out men at a faster rate. I know what you're referring to, that 2013, cessation of combat activity that Panetta referred to. Mm-hmm. But if you extrapolate from that to say we're going to speed up the withdrawal, what a lot of people don't think of is that this requires then an additional logistical effort. Mm-hmm. That logistical effort is made more difficult because Pakistan has closed the land routes through Pakistan. And I've been reading that there's new agreements have been made for routes through the northern countries, through Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and even Russia. There's, I think, 5 countries are negotiating with the United States to allow the U.S. to use their territory as a transportation route for taking men and equipment out of.
These are the NATO supply routes, right? That were open between Afghanistan and Pakistan through the tribal areas, right?
Well, no, this is through foreign countries I'm talking about in the north.
No, I
mean
the
tribal areas.
Yeah, the supply routes that were closed off by Pakistan.
What is closed is Pakistan. Yes, that's correct.
Correct.
Yes, when I say closed, I mean Pakistan. And yeah, some of them transit a tribal area, but the main one route goes through Peshawar.
Right.
And the other one goes through, the area of Quetta and the south.
Okay. No, but there's also news that Pakistan is obviously trying to levy fees on the transportation of supply and men through those regions, and negotiating, et cetera, with Afghan as well as U.S. government in terms of how to reopen them again, the supply routes, that is.
Yes, there are ongoing negotiations, but my main point is that I think it's not feasible for us to accelerate the withdrawal of U.S. forces, because that doesn't take into account the logistical issue, mm-hmm. which now has been complicated because we do have this, let's call it temporary closure of the Pakistani land routes. I mean, that to me is another reason to adhere mm-hmm. to the 2014 time frame. And also when Panetta said that we're going to try to cease our involvement in combat operations, that doesn't mean we're leaving. I mean, one thing is not engage in combat. The other thing is leaving altogether, because you can have a robust military presence in Afghanistan that's involved in training, that's involved in advice, providing an advisory function, and is not engaged directly in combat. Now, I think, what he was talking about is that we want to phase out from the combat operations, which has been the plan all along. Mm-hmm. By the way, I mean, the whole plan is to have the Afghan army take the lead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that plan is being implemented, but the 2014 deadline still remains. And of course, in the interim, there have been all kinds of issues that have been, arising in the region. Whether it's the latest incidents of Quran burning, and I was wondering whether you can talk about that, whether you can touch on that in terms of what is your understanding of what actually happened and what steps is the U.S. government taking to rectify the situation in terms of the Quran burning incidents?
Well, first of all, I think the United States has taken several steps to rectify the situation and ameliorate the damage that was done. I've read that they're now going to give courses on handling of Islamic materials to the soldiers. You got to ask yourself why, after 10 years, they waited this long for that kind of instruction. It's difficult to talk specifically about what happened with the Quran burning, because there's 3 ongoing investigations: 1 American, 1 Afghan, and 1 joint American-Afghan. There's 3 investigations. Mm-hmm. There have been leaks in the newspapers about what these investigations have found, but they haven't published the results yet. Mm-hmm. So as it stands now, it looks like it was a mistake, and that the soldiers didn't know what they were doing. Okay, which is a kind of a sorry excuse, given how volatile this issue is, but it appears to be a mistake. But that's not the final word. We haven't had the final analysis on that. So, we can't really make a judgment in lieu of the results of the investigation. Having said that, the way I interpret the furor over the Quran burning is there's different aspects to it. First of all, you have to take into account, when you look at the rioting and the death toll, I think it's around 30 Afghans killed in rioting. Then you've got the 6 Americans who were killed on the bases. Mm-hmm. But focusing on the rioting, you have to take into account that the Taliban is there as a provocateur, that they are there organizing people, motivating people, agitating to make the riots worse. You take the city of Kabul, there's millions of people that live in Kabul. Mm-hmm. Well, millions of people didn't riot. We just had a few thousand that rioted. So I think you have to take into account that most Afghans didn't rush out in protest over this desecration. There was, thousands, took to the streets. I think some of that rioting was spontaneous and heartfelt and emotional. But I think part of it also was manipulated by the Taliban. I would just assume that, because the Taliban has had a consistent propaganda campaign that the U.S. forces desecrate the Koran, because their central theme is that our presence there is an attack on Islam. So as an expression of our central presence in Afghanistan being an attack on Islam, mm-hmm. from that flows that we desecrate the Koran. And there have been several instances in the past where the Taliban have fabricated reports of Quran burnings, mm-hmm. which have led to protests and even deaths. So this is not the first time that they protest over this issue. But there's different ways to look at this. One is, this is kind of the culmination of a long-standing Taliban propaganda campaign, which we have been too inept to forestall. Mm-hmm. But another way to look at it is that there's other resentments that play into this. You know, resentments over civilian casualties caused by airstrikes, resentments over the way NATO convoys drive on the streets of Afghanistan, on the roads in Afghanistan. There's a series of resentments over actions that U.S. and NATO forces have taken over the years. You know, to give you an example, I think it was either last year or the year before, I forget exactly. There was a riot in Kabul over a report that a U.S. Military convoy had run over a pedestrian in Kabul. We ran over an Afghan. Now, I don't even know if it's true, but that was a rumor. But people came together and rioted because of that. But what does that tell you? That there's resentment over the way foreign soldiers are driving their vehicles in Afghan roads and in Afghan streets. And by the way, ISAF itself recognizes this because, you know, I remember, you know, when I visited ISAF and I was in the ISAF cafeteria, they had a big poster there that says, "Be careful how you drive." So ISAF is aware of this issue. So that as a source of resentment between them and the civilian population.
So talk about that a little bit. Now, given you've been involved in training, right? I think I can say that you've been involved in training soldiers and you're an anthropologist, I think, by your professional training, and you're a language area expert as well, in multiple regions, including South Asia. So culturally, and you've been involved in training soldiers and personnel that goes into the area on, you know, cultural sensitivity or understanding the local culture, and this resentment partly stemming from this, you know, deep-seated sort of cultural idea in Afghanistan and in the Valley, which, you know, detests occupation, right? Or
well, yes, and the soldiers that I train, they get extensive briefings on that, with slides. I mean, we even show slides from Taliban websites showing, and here, you know, what they don't like, what don't they like, but some things that we've stopped. For example, the U.S. military and NATO used to do coordinate search operations in villages, in Pashtun villages, where they'd go into people's homes and search for weapons, search for terrorists. As part of this operation, they would frisk the Pashtun women to make sure they didn't have weapons under their burqas. This was horribly antagonizing to the Pashtun tribes. One, we're entering their homes, and then we're searching their women. And I always said, well, you know, it's cost benefit. Let's assume that by all these pat downs, you find a Pashtun woman that's got a rifle under her burqa or a weapon under her burqa. Say you actually find one. I don't think they ever have, but let's just assume that you find one. Is it worth it for that? In other words, you're never going to have absolute security. And is it worth it to find that one person with a weapon hidden under their clothes to do all these searches that are going to turn entire tribes and entire villages against you? I don't think it's worth it. And yes, that's the kind of briefing we give. And as a result, I mean, not just of my briefing, but, you know, other factors, you know, because other people have said this as well. And even people in the field, you know, can see the negative results of it. So the U.S. Army is a learning organization. And so as a result, they don't frisk women anymore. You know, this has been ended. Even house searches by the U.S. military. My understanding is we don't do that anymore. Now, you know, you do joint patrols, and if you need to search a house, the Afghans are the first one in the door. In most cases, you know, there's always exceptions. You know, anything you say categorically is always wrong because there's always exceptions. But I'm saying, as a general rule, we are now trying to get the Afghan army and the Afghan police to have that kind of interface with the Afghan civilian population, because it's less offensive if the Afghans do it amongst themselves than if you have foreigners do it. So I think that's an improvement that has been made. But the problem is, over the years, this resentment has built up. The house searches the night raids, the frisking of women, the civilian casualties from airstrikes. I think there's been a cumulative building up of resentment, and a principal illustration of this is President Karzai himself. President Karzai has been vociferous in his condemnation of civilian casualties due to airstrikes. And he's also been vociferous about night raids, which actually leads us to another critical piece of the negotiations for a long-term presence that we can get into later. But to finalize my comments on this issue, I don't see the rioting over the Koran burning as being just over the Koran burning. I view it as an expression of long-standing, smoldering resentment over a variety of actions that coalition forces have taken over years. That's built up, and then it coalesces around this one issue of the Koran burning, which the Americans and foreigners have been warned many times, don't do it, don't do it. It just really bothers us. And then we go and do it again. And this time is different from all the other reports, because this time we've admitted it. This is the first time we've ever admitted it that I know of.
Right.
And I know a lot of people have criticized President Obama for his apology.
Right.
I think it was the absolute correct thing to do.
Okay.
He was absolutely correct in issuing that apology.
Okay. So
By the
now,
way, President Bush also issued apologies in similar situations, but let's not get partisan.
right. So now America declares victory and leaves the region. Doesn't want to be painted as an occupier, but on the order of 30,000 troops still remain as an advisory contingency force. Is that the sort of the paint out the scenario for us, Lau, in terms of how this wraps itself, into next year and the year after?
Well, let me address that. I mean, no, it hasn't been spelled out, and the plan is still being defined.
Okay.
And actually, it's being defined as we speak. I mean, there's some critical negotiations going on right now. And if you're going to show this broadcast over the next several days, I mean, here's the deadline. The deadline is May of this year, I mean, 2 months from now, when you're going to have the summit in Chicago of NATO representatives and Karzai and the U.S. All right, and then I think they're going to have another subsequent conference in another country, I think.
But they've had previous meetings already. There was a meeting in Bonn, which was an earlier meeting to sort of decide certain parameters of how the exit strategy will work. But clearly, the summit that's coming up in May is the big one, right? Where the Karzai.
Well, yes, this is the big one, but
okay.
There's something even more important than that summit itself. To me, the summit is a marker, because when you're saying in your question, we're leaving, okay, it hasn't been defined how many forces we're leaving behind. I mean, part of the strategy is that we're not going to leave. See, this is something that a lot of people don't fully comprehend. But the strategy is that U.S. combat forces are leaving, that the U.S. and NATO combat forces are leaving. And this is what motivated Panetta's comment about cessation of combat activity. He said by 2013, it could be 2014, but it's going to be over the near term. That has decided. But the corollary to that is that the plan as it stands now is to have a continuing military presence to conduct training and to provide an advisory function to the Afghan army and the Afghan police, and to have U.S. special forces that will conduct raids, with their special equipment and their special techniques. They will conduct anti-terrorist raids against targeted individuals, and they are also going to, participate in the VSOALP program, which is creating local civilian defense forces at the local level, having local people fighting the Taliban through what's called, VSO is Village Stability Operations, ALP is Afghan local police. That's a whole discussion in and of itself, but let's stick to the withdrawal timetable. our strategy is that all these activities, VSO ALP, raids, special forces raids, training, advisory function, all of that is going to continue after 2014. That's the idea. That's the plan. Now, this should take far fewer soldiers, far fewer U.S. military personnel than what we have now. But the critical thing is the actual number hasn't been decided upon, and this strategy that I have just summarized has not been formally approved by the Afghan government.
I see.
That negotiation is going on right now, and I think the term for it is the strategic partnership or something. It escapes me right now. But these negotiations actually have been going on for about a year. They're going on right now, and the importance of the May summit is that a lot of international leaders and observers have said for the May summit to be as fruitful as possible, we need to have that agreement with the Afghan government before May, right? So we've got 2 months to formalize the agreement on exactly how many U.S. forces are going to stay after 2014 and exactly what their function is, the strategic partnership. That has to be formally ratified by the Afghan government. It hasn't been. So far, what we have is a strategy. We have a plan, but it's not been agreed. Now, the critical thing that has come up recently is Karzai has put some conditions which 5 U.S. senators that visited Afghanistan recently, including Senator McCain, have said are unacceptable, which is Karzai has said he wants a cessation of the night raids. And he's also added another condition. He wants an immediate turnover of the prisons, the detention centers. Let's call them the detention centers that the United States has in Afghanistan. As far as I know right now, it's just Bagram. The others that escape me right now, but I really think we're talking about Bagram. He wants Bagram turned over to Afghan authorities immediately. Now, initially, we balked at that. We have now modified our position because we're trying to make a deal, and we have said that we're willing to do this in 6 months. Turn over Bagram detention facility, not the whole base, detention facility.
Got it. Okay.
To the Afghan government. We're willing to do it in 6 months. Karzai says, no, I want it immediately.
So in the couple of minutes that we have, talk about the development goals then, which we haven't touched on in the Afghan region, which, according to surveys done by Asia Society and other development agencies like USAID and World Bank, show signs of, clear improvement with all the spending that has gone on in the Afghan region. So talk about that in terms of, how schooling, girls' schooling, maternal health, and other urban infrastructure types of projects. How's that going in the Afghan region?
Well, I think all the quantitative data indicates that there has been. A lot of people tend to be real negative about Afghanistan because they get caught up in the headlines, riots, Taliban, and so on and so forth, and we take our eye off the whole picture. The whole picture includes very concrete improvements in education, in healthcare. For example, the infant mortality rate has gone down. Health clinics are now available in many communities that didn't have health clinics before. I mean, there have been undeniable concrete improvements in health and education, and in women's rights as well. And, we hear all these, horror stories about women being abused, that everybody says, oh, nothing's changed in Afghanistan. Well, the very fact that these horror stories make the news and that the Afghans themselves are complaining about it, it means that they don't accept it anymore the way they used to. That there is change, there is a greater awareness. So I would argue that socially there has been many improvements in Afghanistan. However, having said that, some of the statements from the World Bank and the International Red Cross that have come out lately are very worrisome, because they say that a lot of this improvement has been due exclusively to massive foreign aid. And the trend that we see is that aid's being cut back. For example, U.S. aid, was cut from $4 billion in 2010 to $2.5 billion in 2011.
And then
So
there's this whole element of corruption, right? The New York Times story just recently, where one of the major bankers at the Bank of Kabul itself has been involved in, literally running a casino or a gambling parlor, where some of the new rich, if you will, in Kabul are out, partying, gambling, thousands of dollars, while the average Afghan is living on, a few $100s a year.
There's that. The corruption, it not only siphons off aid money, it delegitimizes the government. One of the big Taliban propaganda themes is the corruption. If the Afghan government doesn't get corruption under control, this could sink, the whole program, everything we're trying to do.
Thank you, Dr. Munoz, for joining us today, and I want to thank our audiences for listening to this sort of inside the Beltway discussion on exactly how complicated and complex the strategy is on the ground in terms of the drawdown from the Afghan region. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and hope you can join us again and fill us in on how the situation is improving in the Afpak Valley, in the Afghan region.